The first whispers started on a humid August night when Moses dragged himself back to the slave quarters just before dawn, his legs trembling like a newborn calf's. The men gathered around him, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity as he collapsed onto the dirt floor, unable to stand. "What did she do to you?" asked Thomas, the oldest among them, his voice barely above a whisper. Moses shook his head, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. His hands were blistered and raw, his back soaked through with perspiration. Can't say," he gasped. "Master's orders, but Lord have mercy. I never knew a woman could—" He didn't finish. He couldn't. Within an hour, the overseer was dragging him to the fields anyway, whip in hand, and Moses limped behind him, each step of visible agony. The pattern repeated itself with disturbing regularity. Every few nights, the house servant would appear at the quarters after the last bell, lantern swinging in the darkness, calling out a name. Always one of the strongest men, always someone young, virile, capable of the hardest labor, and always, without fail, that man would return before sunrise, looking like he'd been through a battle, legs shaking, barely able to walk, sometimes with scratches on his arms or strange bruises on his hands. The plantation called Ashford Manor sat like a cancerous growth on the Mississippi landscape, its white columns gleaming in the sun while the blood and sweat of 200 souls watered its cotton fields. Master Silas Ashford was known throughout the county as a particularly vicious owner, a man whose cruelty seemed to stem from some deep inadequacy he tried to mask with brutality. His wife, Isabella, had arrived 5 years ago from a declining Charleston family, traded like livestock herself to settle her father's gambling debts. The slaves had watched her arrival with wary eyes. She was beautiful in the cold, sharp way of a knife blade. Pale skin, dark hair always pulled back severely, eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. In those first years, she barely spoke to anyone, slave or free, moving through the manor like a ghost in expensive dresses. But then, 2 years ago, something changed. The nightly summons began. Jericho had been at Ashford Manor for only 3 months when they called his name. He stood 6'7" in his bare feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry 2 bales of cotton at once. His back was a road map of scars from 3 different plantations, each set of marks telling a story of resistance and punishment. His eyes held the kind of cold fury that made even the overseers hesitate before approaching him. They'd purchased him at auction in New Orleans after his previous master died, and Silas had been pleased with his acquisition. Here was a slave who could do the work of 3 men. What Silas didn't know was that Jericho had been planning escape since the day the chains first closed around his ankles 15 years ago. He'd learned patience during those years, learned to watch and wait and gather information. He knew which stars pointed north. He knew the patrol routes and the distances between plantations. He knew exactly how many overseers worked each night shift and where they kept the dogs. He also knew about the whispers regarding Isabella Ashford. Every man in the quarters had a theory about what happened in that bedroom. Some said she was possessed by demons that fed on male strength. Others claimed she was a witch who drained vitality through dark magic. A few whispered that she had such insatiable carnal appetites that she wore men out like ridden horses, that she demanded things no decent woman would speak aloud. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, and Isabella's reputation transformed from mysterious to monstrous. Silas himself seemed to take a perverse pride in his wife's notoriety. He'd make comments during dinner parties, crude jokes about his wife's particular needs that made the other plantation wives gasp and fan themselves. He seemed to enjoy the humiliation, both his own and hers, as if their shared degradation somehow made him more powerful. When the house servant appeared at the quarters that November night and called Jericho, the big man stood without hesitation. Several of the others grabbed his arms. "Don't go, brother," whispered Samuel, who'd been called 3 weeks prior and still walked with a pronounced limp. "Ain't nothing but suffering in that house." Jericho shook them off gently. "Ain't got a choice." But his hand went to the small, sharpened piece of metal he kept hidden in the hem of his trousers. If that white woman thought she could torture him for her amusement, she'd find herself with a blade in her throat. And then he'd use that same blade on himself because he'd decided long ago that he'd rather die than be any white person's plaything. The walk to the manor took 5 minutes, but it felt like an execution march. The house servant, an older woman named Ruth, said nothing, but her face was grave. At the servant's entrance, she stopped and turned to him. "Whatever you see in there," she whispered, her voice urgent, "whatever the mistress tells you, you keep your mouth shut. You understand? Not a word to nobody or we all swing." Before Jericho could respond, she opened the door and pushed him inside. The manor's interior was oppressively lavish. Crystal chandeliers, imported carpets, furniture that cost more than a human life. Ruth led him up the servants' stairs to the second floor, down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced white men, and finally to a door at the end of the corridor. She knocked twice, heard a soft, "Enter," and opened the door. Jericho stepped inside, fists clenched, ready for anything. Isabella Ashford stood by the window, still fully dressed in a modest evening gown, her arms wrapped around herself. She turned as he entered, and Jericho saw immediately that something was wrong with the narrative. This was not the face of a predator. Her eyes were hollow, exhausted, haunted. There was a fresh bruise on her left cheek, poorly covered with powder. "Close the door," she said quietly. Her voice was nothing like he'd expected, not sultry or commanding, but flat, defeated. He closed it, his hand still near the hidden blade. Isabella studied him for a long moment. Then, to his absolute shock, she moved to the far side of the room and pulled aside a heavy rug, revealing a portion of floorboard that had been carefully pried up. Beneath it was darkness and the smell of damp earth. "I need you to dig," she said. "There's a tunnel under this room. The men who came before you have been excavating it for months. It's almost complete, but we're running out of time." Jericho stared at her, then at the hole in the floor, his mind struggling to reconcile this reality with what he'd been told. What kind of game is this? No game. Isabella's voice was sharp now, and she moved closer, lowering her voice. "That tunnel leads toward the river, toward the main road. There's a network, people who help slaves escape north. I've made contact with them, but my husband can never know. No one can know." "Why?" The question came out harsh, suspicious. She met his eyes then, and he saw something there he hadn't expected to find in a white woman from a plantation family. Genuine desperation. "Because I want out too," she whispered. "Because this place is a prison for both of us, just different kinds of chains. Because if Silas ever discovers what I'm doing, he won't just kill me. He'll make sure every slave here dies as well. He'd burn this entire plantation down before letting anyone think he'd been outwitted by a woman." The tunnel was a masterwork of desperation. Someone, probably Isabella herself, had carefully planned the route to avoid the main support beams of the house. The earth this far south was red clay, hard as brick in places, and digging it required both strength and silence. The previous men had made progress, but it was slow work. Jericho lowered himself into the narrow shaft, and Isabella handed him a short-handled spade and a bucket. "You'll dig for 3 hours," she explained, her voice clinical now, like she was describing a recipe. "The clay must be brought up in small amounts, and I'll distribute it around the room, in the fireplace, in the window boxes. Nothing can be left that would arouse suspicion. Every sound must be muffled if the house servants here digging were finished. Why should I trust you? Jericho asked, though even as he spoke he was analyzing the tunnel's direction, noting the professional way it had been shored up with stolen boards. You shouldn't, Isabella said simply, but you're going to dig anyway because even a small chance at freedom is worth the risk. She was right. For the next 3 hours, Jericho worked in near total darkness, the only light coming from a single candle Isabella had placed at the tunnel's edge. The clay was brutal. Each strike of the spade barely dislodged a handful of earth. His arms burned, his back screamed. Sweat poured off him in rivers, and the confined space made each breath feel like inhaling fire. Above him, he could hear Isabella moving around the room, her footsteps deliberate and measured. Occasionally, she'd appear at the tunnel's mouth to take the bucket of earth he'd filled, and he'd catch glimpses of her face. Tight with concentration, smudged with red clay dust despite her expensive dress. When she finally told him time was up, Jericho's entire body was trembling with exhaustion. He could barely pull himself out of the shaft. His hands were blistered and bleeding. His legs felt like they'd been filled with lead. "Drink this," Isabella said, pressing a cup of water into his hands. Then she produced a cloth and a small jar. "For your hands. The blisters will be worse tomorrow if you don't treat them." He wanted to refuse, but practicality won out. As she wrapped his hands, he studied her more closely. Up close, he could see more signs of abuse. Not just the fading bruise on her face, but older marks on her wrists like rope burns. Her fingers were calloused in odd places, and when she moved, she did so with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to make herself small. "How long you been planning this?" he asked. 2 years. Since I realized my husband would never let me leave and that asking for help from my family was pointless. Her mouth twisted bitterly. They sold me to settle a debt. Why would they care if I was unhappy? What makes you think them abolition folks will help you? You're white. You're one of them. Isabella looked at him then, and something in her eyes was so bleak it made him uncomfortable. "I learned something living in this house, Jericho. There are different kinds of property. Your chains are iron. Mine are law and custom and a marriage contract, but we're both owned." It wasn't an equivalence, he knew that, and he suspected she knew it too. But there was something in her voice, a genuine understanding of powerlessness that made him reconsider his initial assumptions about her. "The other men," he said, "they all kept quiet. I told them the same thing I'm telling you. If word gets out, everyone dies." Silas would see it as an insurrection. He'd call in the militia, have every slave here hanged as an example. She finished wrapping his hands and stepped back. They kept quiet because they understood the stakes, and because some of them had families here they wanted to protect. Jericho nodded slowly. "How much longer?" 3 weeks. Maybe less if we can work faster. The tunnel needs to extend another 40 feet to reach past the garden walls and connect with the drainage ditch that runs to the river. There's a deacon at the Baptist church in town. He's part of the network. He'll have a wagon waiting when we're ready. "We?" Isabella smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You think I'm going to all this trouble just to free others and stay here? When that tunnel is complete, I'm leaving too. Northwest, I don't care, as long as it's away from Silas Ashford." When Ruth came to escort him back to the quarters, Jericho was barely able to walk. The exhaustion wasn't feigned. 3 hours of tunneling in cramped quarters would destroy anyone's legs. He stumbled down the stairs and across the grounds, and when he finally reached the slave quarters, he collapsed just like the men before him. The whispers started immediately, just as they had for all the others. What had the mistress done to him? What perversions had he endured? Jericho said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. The truth was far more dangerous than any rumor. Over the next 2 weeks, Jericho returned to Isabella's room 4 more times. Each night followed the same pattern. Arrive after dark, dig for 3 hours in silence, emerge barely able to stand. The tunnel grew longer, deeper, more stable. Isabella proved to be remarkably knowledgeable about construction. She'd somehow acquired books on engineering and had calculated precise angles for the shaft to prevent collapse. During the brief moments when he rested, they talked in whispers. She told him about her life before Ashford Manor, a childhood in a Charleston mansion that was slowly falling apart, a father who gambled away 3 generations of wealth, brothers who scattered to find work rather than face creditors. She told him about the day Silas came to call, how her father had negotiated her sale like she was livestock, how she'd arrived at this plantation with no illusions about what her marriage would be. "He can't perform," she said one night, her voice matter of fact. "As a husband, I mean. He's incapable, but he's convinced everyone believes he's some kind of virile master, so he constructed this fiction instead. He encouraged the rumors about me, made crude jokes at parties. Better to be a cuckold than impotent in the eyes of his peers." Jericho found himself sharing pieces of his own history in return. A childhood in Virginia before he'd been sold south, a mother he could barely remember, the years of resistance that had earned him those scars on his back. They were strange conversations full of starts and stops, neither of them quite comfortable with the intimacy of shared suffering, but unable to maintain the fiction of master and slave when they were both covered in dirt, working toward the same goal. The other slaves noticed the change in him. Jericho had always been distant, angry, unapproachable. But now there was something different in his eyes, not hope exactly, but a focused intensity that made the men in the quarters uneasy. "You all right, brother?" Samuel asked him one evening. "You look like you seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Jericho replied. But he wasn't fine. Something fundamental was shifting in his understanding of the world. He'd spent 15 years viewing every white person as an enemy, an oppressor, something to be destroyed or escaped from. Isabella challenged that simple binary. She was complicit in the system that enslaved him. She lived in luxury built on stolen labor. But she was also trapped within it, bruised and broken and desperate for freedom. It complicated his anger, and he resented her for it. On his 5th night in the tunnel, the breakthrough happened, literally. His spade struck through the final section of clay, and cool air rushed in from the drainage ditch beyond. He'd reached the exit point. "We're through," he whispered up to Isabella, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw genuine joy flash across her face. "How does it look?" He enlarged the opening carefully, then pulled himself through into the ditch. It was perfect, hidden from view by overgrown vegetation leading directly toward the river road. From here, someone could travel a 1/4 mile under cover before emerging near the main road where the abolitionist contacts operated. When he climbed back up into the bedroom, Isabella was sitting on the floor, her expensive dress covered in clay dust, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Jericho felt something in his chest tighten. He'd never seen a white woman cry with gratitude before. It unsettled him deeply. "When?" he asked. 3 days. The new moon is in 3 days, darkest night of the month. The deacon will have a wagon on the river road at midnight. We'll need to move fast. I can maybe get 6 people through before someone notices they're missing." "Only 6?" Isabella's face hardened. That's the capacity of the contact network right now. 6 people can be hidden, provided with papers, moved north through different routes. More than that, and the system collapses. We'll be caught. and everyone dies. It was an impossible choice. Which 6 among 200? Jericho's mind reeled with the implications. "I'll pick them," he said. "The ones most at risk, the ones who won't break under pressure." Isabella nodded. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his hand. Just briefly, her fingers against his bandaged palm. "You could have killed me that first night," she said softly. "I saw the blade in your eyes, even if I couldn't see the actual weapon. Thank you for not using it." "Still might," Jericho said, but his voice lacked conviction. She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her face entirely. "Fair enough." That was the night Jericho realized he'd stopped seeing her as simply Master's wife. She'd become Isabella, a person, someone fighting her own battle against chains that couldn't be seen or broken with simple tools. It was a dangerous realization. The world has a way of destroying hope before it can fully bloom. 2 days before the planned escape, Jericho was working in the fields when he noticed Marcus, a younger slave who'd arrived 6 months prior, watching him with an odd intensity. Marcus was ambitious in the way some enslaved people were, always trying to curry favor with the overseers, always first to report infractions in hopes of extra rations or lighter work assignments. Jericho felt cold dread settle in his stomach. That night there was no summons to the manor. Jericho lay in his bunk, listening to the sounds of the quarters, and tried to convince himself he was being paranoid. But paranoia had kept him alive this long. At dawn, he found out he was right to worry. Master Silas appeared at the quarters with 6 overseers, all armed. Marcus stood behind them, looking simultaneously triumphant and terrified. "Jericho," Silas said, his voice oily with false pleasantness, "I understand you've been spending quality time with my wife. Now, normally I don't begrudge her little entertainments, but Marcus here tells me there might be more going on than I realized. Says you've been looking mighty satisfied lately. Says you've got that look of a man with a secret." Jericho stood slowly, his mind racing through options. Fight and die here? Run and condemn everyone else? Play ignorant? "Don't know what he's talking about, Master," he said carefully. Silas smiled, and it was a terrible thing to witness. "Well, let's go ask Mrs. Ashford then, shall we? Let's all go have a nice conversation about what you've been doing in her bedroom." The walk to the manor was a death march. Jericho could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching from the fields, from the quarters, from every corner of the plantation. They knew something was happening, even if they didn't understand what. When they reached Isabella's room, Silas threw open the door without knocking. She was there, dressed impeccably as always, reading a book by the window. She looked up with an expression of mild annoyance, the perfect mask of a bored aristocrat disturbed by an intrusion. "Silas," she said coolly, "to what do I owe this dramatic entrance?" "What have you and this slave been doing?" Silas demanded, gesturing at Jericho. Isabella's eyebrow arched. "What I do with the slaves sent to my room is none of your concern. We had an arrangement, remember? You get your little fiction about being a feared master, and I get entertainment. Those were your words, as I recall." It was perfectly played, the bored wife admitting to infidelity with just the right amount of aristocratic disdain. Silas's face went red, torn between his constructed narrative and his jealous rage. "Marcus says there's something else going on. Says this one's been acting strange." "Marcus is an idiot," Isabella said dismissively. She looked at Jericho then, and her face showed nothing but cold disdain. "This one is adequate for manual labor, nothing more. Send him back to the fields." For a moment, Jericho thought it would work. Silas wavered, clearly uncertain. Then Marcus spoke up. "Check the room, Master. Check under the bed, under the floor. I heard talk of strange sounds at night, like digging. Everything happened very fast after that. Silas crossed the room and kicked aside the rug that covered the tunnel entrance. The boards had been replaced, but not well enough to survive scrutiny. When he pried them up and saw the darkness beneath, his face went from red to purple. "What is this?" he whispered, and the quiet in his voice was more terrifying than any shout. Isabella stood, her mask finally cracking. "It's exactly what it looks like, Silas. A way out of this hell you've created." The slap came so fast, Jericho barely saw it. Isabella hit the floor, blood streaming from her nose. Silas pulled a pistol from his belt and pointed it at her. "You treacherous whore! You were going to help them escape? My property?" Jericho moved without thinking. 15 years of suppressed rage finally found an outlet. He covered the distance between himself and Silas in 3 strides, grabbing the plantation master's gun arm before he could fire. The pistol went off, the shot going wide and shattering a window. The overseers rushed forward, but they were crowded in the doorway, impeding each other. Jericho was bigger, stronger, and fueled by pure survival instinct. He wrenched the gun from Silas's hand and brought his other fist around in a devastating arc that caught the smaller man in the temple. Silas dropped like a stone. For a moment, everyone froze. A slave had just struck, possibly killed, a master. There was no coming back from this. Then Isabella was on her feet, shouting, "The tunnel! Go, Jericho, go now!" He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the opening in the floor. Behind them, the overseers were scrambling, raising weapons. A shot rang out, and Jericho felt fire across his shoulder, but adrenaline kept him moving. They dropped into the tunnel together. Above them, chaos erupted, shouting, more gunshots, the sound of running feet. "Can you run?" Jericho gasped. "Yes, go." The tunnel was pitch black, but Jericho had worked in it enough times to navigate by memory and touch. He could hear Isabella behind him, her breathing ragged but determined. Behind her, he could hear the overseers dropping into the shaft, cursing in the darkness. They burst out of the drainage ditch into the pre-dawn gray. Jericho pulled Isabella to her feet and they ran. Not toward the river road where the contact was supposed to be in 2 days, but into the swamp, into the maze of water and moss and alligators where the dogs couldn't track and the overseers feared to follow. Behind them, Ashford Manor erupted into chaos. Bells rang, dogs bayed, men shouted orders. And Jericho, for the first time in 15 years, felt something like hope, kindling in his chest even as his wounded shoulder bled and his legs burned with exertion. They were both free now, or at least, they were both running. In the end, that was almost the same thing. They ran until Isabella collapsed. Her dress, designed for drawing rooms and not swamps, was in tatters. Her face was white with shock and pain, blood still trickling from her nose. Jericho's shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, but the wound wasn't deep. Around them, the swamp breathed, insects buzzing, frogs calling, water lapping against cypress roots. In the distance, faint but growing closer, they could hear the dogs. "We can't stop," Jericho said, though his own body was screaming for rest. "I know." Isabella forced herself to her feet, swaying. "The river. We need to reach the river and cross it. Water will break the scent trail." They stumbled forward, using each other for support now. Master and slave, white and black, both bleeding, both desperate. The old hierarchies meant nothing here in the mud. It took 2 hours to reach the river. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never truly fading. When they finally saw water glinting through the trees, Jericho felt his heart sink. The river was swollen from recent rains, the current brutal. "I can't swim," Isabella whispered. "Then you'll learn today." He stripped off his shirt. used his teeth to tear it into strips despite the pain in his shoulder. "Hold on to me. Don't let go no matter what." The water was shockingly cold. The current grabbed them immediately, trying to tear them apart. Isabella's fingers dug into his shoulders as he swam with one arm, the other locked around her waist. The river carried them downstream, away from the plantation, away from the immediate pursuit. When they finally dragged themselves onto the far bank, they were 2 miles from where they'd entered. The sun was fully up now, and in the distance they could hear church bells ringing. Sunday morning in whatever small town lay beyond the woods. "The deacon," Isabella gasped. "The Baptist church. We need to find it." They made their way through the forest, 2 fugitives who looked like casualties of war. Jericho's shoulder had stopped bleeding but throbbed with each step. Isabella's feet were torn and bloody. She'd lost her shoes somewhere in the swamp. The church sat at the edge of a small black community, its white paint peeling but its bell tower proud. They watched from the trees as people filed in for Sunday service, and Jericho felt something twist in his chest. These people were free, not escaped slaves, but freedmen and women who'd never known chains. Children playing in the churchyard, old folks greeting each other. Normal life, the kind he'd almost forgotten existed. "Wait here," he told Isabella. "You go in there looking like that, looking like what you are, someone might turn us in for the reward." But she shook her head. "We go together. If I can't trust you and you can't trust me, then what was any of this for?" So they walked into that church together during the service, muddy and bloody and desperate. The singing stopped. Every head turned. Jericho saw hands moving toward weapons, saw mothers pulling children close. Then an old man in preacher's robes stood up from the front pew. His eyes moved from Jericho to Isabella and back again, taking in the story written on their bodies. "Well," he said softly, "looks like the Lord sent us some souls in need of shepherding." His name was Deacon Abraham Wright, and he was indeed part of the network Isabella had contacted. Within an hour, they were hidden in his cellar, being treated by his wife, who asked no questions but worked efficiently to clean wounds and provide food. Within 2 hours, plans were being made. "You understand," the deacon said carefully, speaking directly to both of them, "that traveling together is dangerous. A white woman and a black man, people will notice, people will talk. There will be assumptions made that could get you both killed." "I understand," Isabella said firmly, "and I don't care. The reward on you will be substantial," he continued, looking at Jericho. "Master Silas didn't die, though you cracked his skull good. He's putting out notices all over the state. $500 for you, dead or alive, probably preference on dead." Jericho nodded. He'd expected nothing less. "As for you, Mrs. Ashford," the deacon turned to Isabella, "your husband is claiming you were kidnapped and corrupted. He's playing the victim of a slave insurrection. If they catch you with this man, they'll use it to justify worse horrors back at that plantation." "Then we don't get caught," Isabella said simply. Over the next 3 days, the network moved them north. They traveled in the back of wagons under false floors, walked through forests at night following guides who spoke in whispers, hid in barns and basements, and once memorably in a church crypt among the dead. The world revealed itself to be more complex than Jericho had imagined. There were white people who risked everything to help escaped slaves. There were free black communities that had built themselves into something resembling prosperity. There were Quakers and radical Christians and former slaves who'd bought their freedom and now used their resources to free others. And there was Isabella, who proved to be far tougher than her aristocratic upbringing suggested. She never complained, never slowed them down, never asked for special treatment. When Jericho's wound became infected and he collapsed with fever, she was the one who sat with him for 2 days in a safe house outside Memphis, forcing water down his throat and keeping the fever at bay. "Why?" he asked her during one of his lucid moments. "Why risk all this? You could have found easier ways to escape. Could have gone to your family, claimed abuse, gotten an annulment." "My family sold me once," she said quietly, wringing out a cloth to place on his forehead. "Why would they help me now? And besides," she hesitated. "After living in that house, seeing what I saw, how could I leave without trying to help? How could I enjoy freedom knowing I'd left 200 people in chains?" "We only got 6 out," Jericho said bitterly. The knowledge that he'd had to leave so many behind ate at him. 6 is 6. 6 people who might not have escaped otherwise. 6 people who might help 6 more someday. She met his eyes. "We do what we can with what we have. That's all anyone can do." The fever broke on the 3rd day and they continued north. They reached Canada in late winter, crossing frozen Lake Erie with a group of 30 other escapees. The snow was brutal, the cold unlike anything Jericho had experienced in the South. But when they finally set foot on Canadian soil, he understood for the first time what the old folks in the quarters had meant when they talked about Canaan, about the Promised Land. Isabella and Jericho settled in a small community outside Toronto where other formerly enslaved people had built homes and farms. The community regarded them with initial suspicion. A white woman and a black man not married by law but clearly bound together by something deeper than convention. But gradually, as they proved themselves through work and commitment to the community, that suspicion faded. Jericho found work as a blacksmith, his massive strength and steady hands making him invaluable. Isabella became a teacher, educating children who'd never had the opportunity for schooling. In the evenings, she wrote long, detailed letters to abolitionist newspapers describing the realities of plantation life, signing them only with her initials to protect the people who'd helped them escape. They never formally married. The legal and social complications seemed insurmountable, and besides, what was marriage but another form of ownership? Instead, they built a life together based on mutual respect and shared trauma, and the kind of deep understanding that only comes from having survived hell together. Sometimes, on cold nights, Jericho would wake from nightmares of being back in those fields, the whip cracking, the sun burning, and Isabella would be there, her hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. "You're free. We're free." Other times it was Isabella who woke screaming, dreaming of Silas's hands or the moment when everything almost ended. And Jericho would hold her carefully, mindfully, the way one holds something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. News from the South came in fragments. Ashford Manor had fallen into disrepair after Silas's injury left him partially paralyzed and increasingly paranoid. The plantation was sold at auction 2 years after their escape. They never learned what happened to the 200 souls they'd left behind, and that knowledge haunted them both. But they also learned that 6 people who'd used that tunnel before the escape had successfully made it north. 6 people who were now free, building their own lives, telling their own stories. And in abolitionist circles, there was a story that circulated, perhaps embellished, perhaps partially fiction, but with enough truth at its core to inspire others. They told of a woman who dug a tunnel to freedom beneath her own bedroom, of the strongest slave on a plantation who'd become the strongest ally, of an impossible partnership that had defied every expectation and convention. They never confirmed or denied these stories. Let people believe what they needed to believe. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any tale could capture. Years later, when the war finally came and made their escape retroactively legal,